everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in to study some Jewish history together. So tonight we are adding to what we'll call the triumvirate of the three most influential people on changing Jewish life in the modern world, or really revolutionizing the modern Jewish era. Last week we discussed the Baal Shem Tov, who would be the first of the three, and tonight we are going to discuss the Vilna Goan, aka the Gra, as well as Lahavdil, Napoleon, who also we'll see had a tremendous effect on revolutionizing the position of the Jew in the modern world. So let's jump right in and do it. As we focus on the Vilna Goan, we're focusing on the area of Lithuania, which at this point in time, the point in time we're discussing, was part of the Polish Empire, but as the Polish Empire is starting to dwindle and the imperialistic Russian Empire is growing strength, we're going to see that Lithuania will switch teams, so to speak, to fall under the Russian influence. It'll eventually become part of the USSR, and in modern times, it's an independent country. Right now, in 2022, for now, it's an independent country. So, but it's always, Lithuania was traditionally, up until this point in history, part of the Polish Empire and part of what we call the Arba Aratzos, the four lands that we talked about before. And Lithuania was in many ways the central part of the central headquarters of the Jewish world when it came to things like Torah learning and Torah study and Torah scholarship. And even more so, when we look at the city of Vilna, Vilna was referred to as Yerushalayim Delita, of the Jerusalem of Lithuania. So if Lithuania was considered the center of the world Jewish scholarship at this point, Vilna was considered the Jerusalem of that center. And even though Vilna is not the capital of Lithuania, the capital of Lithuania is Kovna, also was a major Jewish city. We'll discuss these cities a little bit more in the coming weeks, but Vilna was considered the capital of Jewish scholarship. And in many ways that was due to the Vilna Goan, but in many ways the Vilna Goan was an outgrowth of what already was the culture and the situation in Vilna. Now, Vilna was an area, or Lithuania in general at this point, was an area that was extremely poor. We talked about in general the other parts of the Polish Empire, Poland, Ukraine, and the Russian Empire, where the plight of the Jew was very rough. It was especially rough in Lithuania, which is kind of funny in a modern day snapshot, because in more modern times, Lithuania is out of the former Soviet states, is in many ways moved very far away from its Soviet past, or its Russian past, if you will, but Biazimay at this point is a very, very poor place, and the focus was Torah. That was the focus in Lithuania. That was the focus in Vilna. That was really the Jewish focus in many ways. Now, at this point, the Jewish community in Lithuania was maybe 250,000 Jews, and we're going to see that's actually going to dwindle from this point forward in Jewish history to the point where before World War II, after the decimation of World War I, it'll go down to 160,000 Jews, but during the beginning of the war, it'll swell back to 250,000, because that'll initially be a place where the Jews figure they can find refuge, they can find, it's not initially under control of either the Germans on one hand or the Soviets on the other hand. At first comes under control of the Soviets, then goes under control of the Germans in a very short period of time. But before that point, 1941, from 1939 to 1941, it's looked at as a sort of a safe haven for Jews. So we're going to see that population swell back up at the beginning of the war, but unfortunately most of those Jews will be eradicated in World War II. But with 250,000 Jews at this point in the late 18th century, that is really the center of the Jewish world. Now, the Vilna Goan was born in 1720. He lives until 1797, so he functions for the greater part of the 18th century. Now, there are three main areas we'll focus tonight as his contributions. Number one, that last week when we talked about the war against the Hasidim from the Lithuanian community, well, that was really spearheaded in many ways by the Vilna Goan. He was really the forefront of that war. As long as he's alive, the war goes on. Once he passes away, that combined with the Haskalah and the need to make peace, to fight Haskalah, as we'll talk about next week, that was the end of the war between the Hasidim and the Litvaks. So that war was in many ways his. The Yeshiva movement, which we'll talk about more in the coming weeks, the Yeshiva movement, the Vilna Gaon is really considered the intellectual forefather of the Yeshiva movement. Even though it didn't start till after his death, we'll see that his main student, Rav Chaim Volozhiner, discussed a lot of the ideas and concepts of the Yeshiva movement that Rav Chaim Volozhiner would eventually start with the Vilna Gaon. So therefore, the Vilna Gaon is really the intellectual forefather of the Yeshiva movement, and also the Musar movement, which will be an outgrowth of the Yeshiva movement. They will look towards the Vilna Gaon really as their intellectual forefather as well. Okay, so those are the three areas we're going to talk about when we talk about the Vilna Gaon. Now, the Vilna Gaon, when he comes onto the scene, is really in many ways a throwback to 1,000 years before, or maybe 500 years before. His main student, the Rav Chaim Volozhiner, compared him in many ways to the Rambam, which would put him as a 500-year throwback. So even though the Vilna Gaon is what we call an Achron, one of the latter-day Torah scholars, in many ways he's treated like a Rishon. Now that does have ramifications in Jewish law. We usually, when we talk about the different demarcations of Jewish scholarship, we say that a Rishon, the medieval commentators, could only argue with other Rishonim, and the Achronim, the latter Torah commentators, could only argue with Achronim. There are exceptions to that, and one of those is the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was considered like a Rishon, like a medieval commentator, being able to argue on the Rashi, Rambam, Ritva, Rashba, whoever, even though he was technically an Achron because of the time period that he lived. Now, his impact was such that after he passes away in 1797, the city of Vilna never again appoints a chief rabbi. In other words, it's a position that he had not only for life, but so to speak, in his afterlife as well. Now, the Vilna Gaon, like many other great Torah scholars, there's countless legends about him, and like we said about the Baal Shem Tov last week, that a lot of times it's hard to verify whether these legends are true or not. But as Rabbi Beryl Wein often says, I don't know if this story is true, but I'll tell you one thing: they don't tell it about you and me. So through the legends, we can get an idea of the character that we're dealing with. Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner said about his Rebbe, the Vilna Gaon, he said, first of all, he said about himself, he said, I know the Talmud like Ashrei, right? Ashrei is considered one of those prayers that most Jews know by heart. And he said, I know the Talmud like I know Ashrei. In other words, Rav Chaim Volozhiner was saying, I know the Talmud ball pass, so to speak. But the Vilna Gaon, he not only knew the Talmud like Ashrei, but he even knew it like Ashrei backwards. So even when we know something by heart, we can recite it by heart, but it's a totally different function of the mind to be able to recite it backwards. So the Vilna Gaon, so to speak, knew the Talmud's frontwards and backwards. Balpeh had a photographic memory, knew the whole thing backwards and forwards, and spent his whole life deeply engrossed in Torah scholarship. He never slept more than 2 hours a night, and then never more than 30-hour segments. In other words, as they tell about the Vilna Gaon, over the 8 hours, so to speak, of the night, he would sleep 4 30-minute segments spaced out by 2 hours, and that was the sleep that he got. It's called, the sleep of the Vilna Gaon, which was pretty amazing. So, and the other 22 hours a day he spent deeply engrossed in Torah study. Now, the title that we gave him, the Goan means genius. So he was called the Genius of Vilna. And in general, now ever since the Vilna Gaon, since the 18th century, when we refer to the Goan, even though that was a term that we've talked about a lot, when we talked about the great rabbis of Babylonia, they were called Gaonim. But in general, when we say the Goan or the Goan, depending on how you pronounce it, we are referring to the Vilna Gaon. That is he took that title for posterity. Now his contributions, besides being such an immense scholar and righteous person in his time and being one of the greatest rabbi of his generation, responding to countless issues that came out up throughout the Jewish world, being sent letters from throughout the Jewish world. Many of his accomplishments, or one of the greatest accomplishments he gave us, was our texts. Now, what did he do for all of our texts? If you remember from past Jewish Destiny series sessions, we are already now several hundred years after the printing press. Before the printing press, the way that Jewish texts were handed down one to another is they were hand copied. There were copiers copiers who would copy the text, and that was a method that lent itself to many mistakes. There were many mistakes in text as they were copied over by the copiers. And even when we get into the printing press, even with the printing press, it's very possible to have mistakes, as you can set up the tiles wrong or whatever it is. The Vilna Gaon took on as his life mission to correct many of our texts. Now, he did this through his intellect, and Reb Chaim Volozhin tells us that he took the magnitude of the job of correcting these ancient or holy texts so seriously that he would fast on any day when he made a text correction, as if to beseech the help of heaven that the text would be corrected in the proper way. And as our archaeological, or I should say Geniza studies have gone throughout history, every time we find ancient texts that the Vilna Gaon did not have access to, they have only backed up and validated many, or if not most, of the texts that the Vilna Gaon, most of the changes that the Vilna Gaon made. So in general, scholars, are often quick to change text, say, oh, this doesn't make sense, I'm going to change the text. But the Vilna Gaon, it seems, was always spot on with his corrections to the text. And those corrections were made in the Talmud, both the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, and the Medrash, the Zohar, the Shulchan Aruch, Rashi. Virtually all of our major works of academia that we have were corrected by the Vilna Gaon. So that was a tremendous thing the Vilna Gaon did for us. Now, early in his life, before he was, let's say, or when he was starting to be discovered as a genius that he was, he did something that was somewhat common in this period in time, and that was he went on a self-prescribed gullus, or a self-afflicted gullus, if you will, self-inflicted exile, meaning that for about 3 to 5 years, he traveled from town to town throughout Europe without announcing himself, so to speak. In other words, his reputation already preceded him at this point, but he would go into towns and not reveal himself as Riv Eliyahu Kramer, which was his name, or the Vilna Gaon, for sure not. He would just, disguise himself as a pauper, going from town to town, taking up lodging wherever he could get lodging. And there's all kinds of stories told about people disrespecting him and then figuring out who he was and being, mortally embarrassed as to what they did. But really, one of his goals, and in general, these goals of gullus that people would take was for humility, for people to be able to humble themselves by, they're already reaching a certain level of stature. So they would go into places and pretend like they were not of stature and be treated like the common men, and it was a way to work on your humility. But beyond that, when the Vilna Gaon went on his gullus, he was really looking for Jewish manuscripts throughout the world. He was looking for different libraries and genizas and different manuscripts, because that was really his passion, to collect any and every book he could find, to make corrections. And often when he went from town to town, as much as he tried to hide himself, he was often discovered. Once he started talking to the local scholars, the local rabbis, they figured out that this was no slouch, and they figured it out as the Vilna Gaon. But a lot of the efforts that he made in those 3 to 5 years were what helped him to be able to establish his corrections that he would eventually make in all of our great Jewish works. So beyond Torah scholarship, in many ways, he was a Renaissance man. Now, he wasn't a Renaissance man sort of in the mold that we think of as a Renaissance man. He looked at the Torah as completely holistic, which it is. If you master the Talmud, you master everything, and that's how the Vilna Gaon was. So through his mastery of the Talmud, he mastered mathematics. It's recorded or reported that he wrote a book on geometry, trigonometry, calculus, whatever, different types of mathematics that he wrote books on. He was an expert in music, an expert in philosophy. He wrote that if you don't truly understand and appreciate music, you can't truly understand the words of King David, of David HaMelech, and Psalms, and philosophy too. Really, every subject he was an expert in, but it came through the study of Torah, because as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, "Hapach ba v'kula ba," you turn it completely around and everything's there. And if you study Talmud, you know this. The Talmud touched on every single subject in the world, so through his mastery of the Talmud, he mastered all of these subjects. And his mastery was not only in what we call the revealed Torah and the Talmud, and the Talmud, Torah Sheba'al Peh, that part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, but also he was the greatest Kabbalist of his time. And and he really mastered all levels of Kabbalah. But unlike the Hasidim, who he fought vehemently, he did not feel that Kabbalah was for the masses. And that was one of the issues that he took up with the Hasidim. He felt that Kabbalah taken to the masses was very dangerous. It would lead itself to a possible, God forbid, repetition of the Shabtai Tzvi debacle, and therefore he really felt that Kabbalah was not for the masses, and Kabbalah should be reserved only for the scholar of highest level. And that's a lot of where we get in the Ashkenazi world and in the Lithuanian world, where we get this idea that we're not supposed to study Kabbalah till we're much older, till we're 40, till we're a scholar. A lot of that really comes from the Vilna Gaon, because it seems that those demarcations weren't so, those lines in the sand, so to speak, weren't really drawn before this point in history. And after the Shabtai Tzvi debacle, there was an attempt to totally stay away from Kabbalah. And the Vilna Gaon really draws the line. That has to be done with scholars of age, scholars of mastery. Those are the ones who can study the Kabbalah. Now, along these lines, in his war with the Hasidim, like we said, that was a lot of it was the approach to the Kabbalah. A lot of it was that he felt it would degenerate into cults because of the central role of the Rebbe and all the different Hasidic sects. He thought they could lead itself to more false messianic movements, to magic, all kinds of things, and that's what he was worried about. And therefore, he was the first one to sign a ban of excommunication against the Hasidim, and he was the one who really led the fight that we had talked about last week. Now, what's interesting is the Vilna Gaon lived in a time where there are other greats, and if these other great Torah scholars had lived in any other time, they would have probably been the scholar of their generation, but because they lived in the time of the Vilna Gaon, they were overshadowed by the greatness of the Vilna Gaon. And some of these scholars are the Tiferes Yisrael, one of the great commentators on the Mishnah, the Shagas Aryeh, Rav Yecheskel Landau, the Noda B'Yehuda, and the Dubner Maggid. The Dubner Maggid was one of the famous, really, this was before the Musar movement, but really in many ways created the concepts that would be adopted by the Musar movement. And in fact, the Vilna Gaon would actually have the Dubner Maggid come to him once a year to give him Musar, to really yell at him or trying to set him straight for the things that the Vilna Gaon needed to correct in his life. Now, imagine that job for a minute, like having to tell the Vilna Gaon the things he can correct. And one of these meetings, it's recorded that the Vilna Gaon, that the Dubner Maggid told the Vilna Gaon, like, it's great that you're the Vilna Gaon, sitting here in the base measure, sitting here in your house, but like, try going out into the world, try going out into the marketplace, try being a businessman and being the Vilna Gaon. Then, you couldn't do it. And the Vilna Gaon started crying, and the Dubner Maggid felt very bad about it, and they had a discussion, and the Vilna Gaon said, you're right, I couldn't achieve my levels if I had to be out in the world and not be engrossed in Torah study, but you know what? Nowhere does it say you have to put yourself in that situation. So the Vilna Gaon really was, by fortifying himself in Torah, he had a tremendous impact on the Jewish world, as we said, through what he did for our holy works, for the correspondences. Like we said, every rabbi alive at that time had correspondences back and forth with the Vilna Gaon on different halachic issues. Every major halachic issue of that generation came to the Vilna Gaon, and his influence is really unmatched in modern times. So, as we said, the concept of the Yeshiva movement was really started by the main disciple of the Vilna Gaon, Rav Chaim Volozhiner. Rav Chaim was from the town of Volozhin, not too terribly far from Lithuania and modern-day Belarus. And Rav Chaim Volozhiner discussed the concept of the Vilna Gaon, who was, even though he was focused primarily on Torah study, he was well aware of the changing of the winds of the modern world and the risks and the threats that this presented for the Jewish world. And he understood that with the Enlightenment hitting the world, that it used to be that if a Jew wanted to be a scholar, there was only one address. You studied Torah. You couldn't go to the university. You couldn't do anything else. Torah study was the only option to excel in intellectual pursuits as a Jew. But the Vilna Gaon knew that wasn't the case anymore. So he knew that in order for Torah to, so to speak, compete with modernity, with the university, with the Enlightenment, that Torah had to be, so to speak, treated the same way. So therefore, the concept of the Yeshiva movement came with a set curriculum, with a set methodology, educational goals. Now, before this point, or probably we'll say since the demise of the Babylonian Yeshiva until this point, the way that Torah scholarship worked is someone would learn with the local rabbis, and if they showed, or the local scholars, and when they showed tremendous promise, they would go to a bigger town with a bigger scholar, and then to a bigger town with a bigger scholar, but there was no set place where you would come together to have what we call the Pilpul Chaverim, to have classes, to have lectures, to have the curriculum, the methodology. None of that existed from the demise of the Babylonian Yeshiva until the rise of the Lithuanian Yeshiva. And we're going to see when we talk about in the coming weeks the Yeshiva movement, this was the brainchild of the Vilna Gaon in order to stem the rising tides of enlightenment, of assimilation, because to keep Torah in the way that it would continue to compete with other options in the world, so to speak. Now, to a certain extent, there was a danger in that, because the Torah is supposed to be as fluid as possible. That's why the Torah is not supposed to be written down, with the exception of the Chumash. But as we've talked about throughout the generations, it's been necessary to write down more and more of the Torah, and now all that goes to one step further, to have a set curriculum, a set style of study, and that's what the Vilna Gaon felt was necessary to stem the tides that were raging in the world at that time. Now, one of the things that Vilna Gaon is also famous for was his understanding and really creativity in Tanakh. He was able to he darshaned, he expounded on things that before him no one ever darshaned on. And I'll give you just a few examples of just creative ideas in the Vilna Gaon that I've always found very creative. And one idea is in Megillas Esther, in the book of Esther, when it talks about Esther being taken to Achashverosh to, so to speak, try out to be the queen, the tune that we read that with is called Munach, Munach, Munach. Vegia, Torester, Bas Avichail, Dod Mordechai, right? Munach, Munach, Munach. And when we look at the similar verse, it talks about all the other women going to Achashverosh. It says, Vegia, Kol Nara, V'Nara. I'm sorry for my horrible singing voice, but the trup is Kadma V'Azla. Now, Kadma V'Azla means get up and go. Munach means like stay. So the Vilna Gaon points out that we see from those trup the attitude of the two groups. Esther did not want to go to Achashverosh. So the trup talking about Esther going to Achashverosh was Munach, 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 right? Going slowly with resistance, not wanting to go. But for the other women, they wanted to become the queen of Persia. So Kadma V'Azla, the trup that we read over there is Kadma V'Azla, get up and go, because that was the attitude and the temperament of those women when they were taken to Achashverosh. Another one of my favorite ideas on the Vilna Gaon is that we have the concept of, in tort law, of ayin tachas ayin, one of a very famous, a very misunderstood verse in the Torah, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. So a literal translation, a literal explanation of that, you would think eye for an eye means that if somebody pokes out your eye, that you can poke out their eye. Now the Talmud asks on that and shows how impractical that is, because if the idea is an eye for an eye, well, what if my eye is worth more than your eye, or your eye is worth more than my eye? What if I do a profession where I don't need to have two eyes, and you do a profession that you need to have two eyes? What if I only blinded you halfway? And and on and on and on, to show that it can't be taken literally, and it must be talking about the monetary value, that if somebody puts out your eye, they owe you the monetary value for that eye. The Vilna Gaon said, if that's what the Talmud says, we have to see it in the verses. We have to see it in the verse. It has to be in the written Torah, because the Vilna Gaon was able to look into the Tanakh, look into the Chumash, and see the entirety of Torah. So he said, where do you see that idea over here in the verse ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye? He said, if you take the Hebrew word ayin, yud nun, and you go tachas, underneath each of those letters in the alphabet, what's the next letter after ayin? It's a pei. What's the next letter after yud? It's a chaf. And the next letter after nun is a samech. And if you take those letters and you rearrange them, you have the word kesef, which means money. So ayin tachas ayin, go underneath for the I, you go underneath the I, in other words, the next letter down the alphabet, and you see it's kesef, which means money. Again, one of the beautiful creative ideas for the Vilna Gaon. And the Vilna Gaon saw every word of the Torah like this and expounded on every word of the Torah like this. Now, the Vilna Gaon, there were many in really this time period where we start to have the drive to go back to Eretz Yisrael, the drive to go back to Israel. We're going to see that this is within 100 years of the beginning of the Zionist movement. But long before the Zionist movement, we had the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov, who both put a focus on going to Eretz Yisrael. And we see that the Vilna Gaon made many attempts to get to Eretz Yisrael, to go to Israel. And each time it was thwarted somehow, some way, somewhere. And so the Vilna Gaon said, okay, Min Hashamayim, from heaven, it must be I'm not supposed to go to Israel. But he sent a group of his students to Israel. And they are referred to as the Perushim, and they were really the beginning of the modern settlement of the land of Israel. They went, Israel at this point is under the Ottoman Empire, and it's what we call the Old Yishuv, and they settled the Old Yishuv. And again, it wasn't like today we go to Israel, you fly whatever airline, you get to Ben Gurion Airport, you go through customs, and you live in a world that is as modern as any other country in the world. But no, the Ottomans did not treat the land of Israel very well. It was a backwater part of their empire, and living in Israel at that time was very difficult, very, very difficult. Yet these Perushim, these students of the Vilna Gaon, really prevailed, and the modern settlement of Israel, I'm not going to say the state of Israel because they didn't have Zionistic fervor per se as far as building a state, but they had the fervor to get back to the land of Israel and to settle the land of Israel. But this is really the beginning of it with the students of the Vilna Gaon. Now, because these students of the Vilna Gaon are really the first ones of the modern settlement of the land of Israel, the customs of the land of Israel follow the Vilna Gaon almost to a T. For example, if you ever wondered why, when you were in Israel, candlelighting before Shabbos is 40 minutes before sunset, as opposed to in America where the prevalent custom is 18 minutes before sunset, well, that's the position of the Vilna Gaon. And when and really throughout the country, the custom of the land of Israel are the customs of the Vilna Gaon. And what's interesting is the Vilna I think we mentioned this last week, is the Litvaks and Hasidim alike at this point in time wore the same type of clothing. And therefore, when the Perushim get to Israel, they keep the dress of the European Jew. And therefore, when you're in Israel today, if on Shabbos you see someone wearing a strimal, or during the week you see someone wearing a purple frock and a Platz Gabiba hut, one of the flat furry hats, they're not necessarily Hasidim. In Brooklyn, that guy would be a Chassid. But in Meir Sharim, or in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, he might be a descendant of the Perushim, of the students of the Vilna Gaon. He might be a Chassid, because we're going to see that became the dress of all of the early settlers of Israel, whether they were Hasidic or Litvish. That's what they wore. Now, on the tails of the students of the Vilna Gaon coming to Israel, there was also a group of students from the Baal Shem Tov, from the Hasidim, that came to Israel as well. And these two groups make the early settlers of the land of Israel. One interesting fact about this group is that this group came to Yerushalayim, and what we call it now the Old City Yerushalayim, the Old City Jerusalem, and there was a central shul that had been built in the Old City that was built by Rav Yehuda Chassid, who went to Israel and unfortunately didn't live very long when he made it there, but he went to Israel in the early 18th century. And when he was there, he built a synagogue on the ruins of a shul that had been in Jerusalem that was built in the 15th century. And he built a synagogue on the ruins. But shortly, I think within a decade after the synagogue was built, in the year 1721, the Ottoman authorities destroyed the synagogue because the Jews, unfortunately, were unable to pay the debts, the debt that they had taken on, the mortgage or whatever it was, to buy the property and to build the property. So the Ottomans destroyed the synagogue in 1721, and from that point on, the synagogue became known as the Chorva Shul, the destroyed shul, or the ruins, or the ruin shul. Now, 116 years later, in 1837, when the students of the Vilna Gaon come, and the Perushim, as we're calling them, come, they're going to need a synagogue, and they will rebuild the synagogue in the same spot, actually in 1864, so a few decades after they come. And even though the shul was officially named the Beis Yaakov Synagogue, it will be called the Chorva Shul from this point forward. Now, it also happens that if we fast forward to the 1948 War of Independence, that the Arab Legion, the Jordanian Arab Legion, actually blows up the synagogue in the War of Independence. And when the Jews retake the Old City in 1967, the decision is made to rebuild the Chorva Shul, and a commemorative arch is put up. I think in 1968 or 69 it was put up, but the building wouldn't be a plan to rebuild the building wouldn't be agreed upon until the year 2000, and the synagogue would not actually be rebuilt until 2010. But when you go to the Old City today, you see the beautiful Chorva Synagogue, rebuilt exactly as it was remembered to be in 1948, which was supposedly how it was before that. And they have a beautiful inside the synagogue. You should definitely go in next time you're there. It's a beautiful synagogue, but they have a beautiful. They tell you this history in pictures and in details of the Chorva Synagogue. So if you thought it was called the Chorva Synagogue because it was destroyed in 1948, that was the second time it was destroyed. So now it's more apropos that is called the Chorva Shul because it was destroyed twice, rebuilt I guess 3 times now, and hopefully it'll never be destroyed again. But what's interesting is the group that rebuilt it, was instrumental in having it rebuilt in 2000, was what we call the Zilberman Talmidim, who are really today encapsulate the customs of the Vilna Gaon, and they're the ones who control the synagogue, or it's under their auspice. So when you daven there, it is really to a T the custom of the Vilna Gaon. So even though there might be different customs elsewhere in the Jewish world, they're not like the Vilna Gaon. If you want to see exactly how the Vilna Gaon prayed, go to the Chorva Shul, dive in there, and you'll see it is exactly in the style of the Vilna Gaon. So it is apropos that even in modern times, those who really have maintained his customs are the ones who are still davening in that shul. So Vilna Gaon passes away in 1797. He's buried in Vilna. And in 1950, after the Soviets, this is after World War II, the Soviets are in control of Lithuania. It's part of the Soviet Union, it's part of the Soviet bloc. And in their true respect for culture and history, they plan to build a stadium and concert hall over the side of the old Jewish cemetery in Vilna, and they do. But beforehand, they at least allow the remains of the Vilna Gaon to be reinterred in a new Jewish cemetery. So when you go to visit the grave of the Vilna Gaon today, that was not the original site. That's not the original building that was there. That was all rebuilt in 1950, and thank God it survived the Soviet control of Lithuania, and it is still something that you can visit unto this very day. I've been there myself, a beautiful place to visit, and that's a little bit about the Vilna Gaon. In 1789, in the beginning of the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was passed, and it guaranteed freedom of religion and free exercise of worship for all religions within France, provided that it didn't mess with the public in a negative way. Now, even though the French Revolution initially was France becomes the first country to emancipate the Jews, and these ideas of fraternity, equality are ideas that they espouse, these liberal ideas, really the creation of liberal ideas in the world. We're going to see that within a few years, the French Revolution runs amok and needs to get back on track, so to speak. Enters a very savvy military man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte was actually originally from Italy, but his family moved to France, and he was a very successful general in the French army. And we're going to see that after the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov, Lahavdil, he is the one who really changes the modern world for the Jew in the greatest way. So what happens is, in 1799, November 9th, 1799 to be exact, he launches a coup d'etat, which leaves him in charge of the French government. And while he is very into the ideas of liberalism of the French Revolution, and we're going to see that everywhere that he goes and conquers, he brings those ideas with him, we're going to see he's not so into the ideas of democracy. So even though he brings these ideas of liberalism, it's with a dictatorship. So it's an interesting dichotomy. But he is a man that his influence is felt throughout Europe, and especially throughout France, until this very day. And really, there's almost like a love-hate relationship with him, especially in France. Like, people almost don't know what to make of him. In many ways, they say what he did was great. In many ways, because of the dictatorship, they say it was terrible. But he is definitely one of the most controversial leaders on the map of world history. Now, when he takes over and begins his empire, his French empire, he wants to make France the major world power, and the main competition at that point was England, and he will successfully do it. He will build an empire probably greater, just as big, if not greater than the size of Alexander the Great, than the Roman Empire. And, one thing about these dictators and these imperialistic regimes is they think and act as if they're going to exist forever. And they have an aura of invincibility around them that people think they're going to be there forever. Now, Napoleon will last all of 12 years. We see this also with Hitler, Yamach Shemo. Hitler said he was building a Reich that would last 1,000 years. It lasted 12 years. And, these often don't last. But be it as it may, he does conquer a great part of the known world. The known world was much more known at that point than at the time of Alexander the Great, but he conquers virtually all of Western Europe, France, Germany, not England, but France, Germany, Prussia, Austria. He conquers the Iberian Peninsula, the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. He goes into North Africa, conquers Egypt. He goes to Israel. We're going to see that he does not successfully conquer Israel, but he has we'll put the map up here on the screen to see there's a large swath of land that goes under his influence. And eventually, what will do him in will be the same, really the same thing that does Hitler in, is when he tries to conquer Russia. That even though he'll have initial success like Hitler did, Russia's just like too big of a pill to swallow. It's never been conquered, and that will be in the end his downfall. And he'll be taken down by a coalition of many who wanted to see him go. But everywhere that he goes and conquers, he brings these ideas of the French Revolution with him. So, in I guess a good sense, he brings this concept of not persecuting the Jews, but really, if we look at what his goals were to assimilate the Jew. His goal was not that the Jew should be able to be free and practice as a Jew and live as a Jew. He wanted to assimilate the Jew into the countries that he conquered, and therefore the Reform movement is going to, in the early Enlightenment, is going to completely embrace Napoleon, whereas we're going to see traditional Jews are going to be a little bit more skeptical and a little bit more concerned of the success of Napoleon, because everywhere he conquers, the Jews are emancipated, but emancipated with the goal of assimilation. And we're going to see some of the actions that Napoleon takes to achieve this goal. Now, in 1807, Napoleon designates Judaism as one of the official religions of France, along with Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinist Protestantism, and again, really setting this tone of freedom of religion. But like we said, we always have to take it with a grain of salt that the goal was really to assimilate the Jew. Now, even though Napoleon was a Roman Catholic, he definitely wasn't very frum. And the story is told that when he was coronated as the King of France, he actually brought the Pope from Italy to Paris for his coronation. And as the Pope was putting the crown on the head of Napoleon, Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope and puts it on his own head, as if to show that the Pope was subservient to him and he was above the Pope. Now, even though we see that Napoleon, on paper or in the public, seemed to have a certain benevolency to the Jews, we see in a letter that has been preserved to his brother Jerome Napoleon, that was dated March 6, 1808, how he truly felt about the Jews. He wrote in the letter that, "I have undertaken to reform the Jew, but I have not endeavored to draw more of them into my realm. Far from that, I have avoided doing anything which could show any esteem for the most despicable of mankind." So that shows you what Napoleon thought of the Jews. And in this goal of assimilating the Jews, he really took a direct hand in it. He didn't just emancipate the Jew and let, in other parts of the world, let really the just nature take its course. He got directly involved in the assimilation of the Jews. Now, early in his career, in 1799, Napoleon actually goes to Eretz Israel, and he lays siege to the city of Akko, which was a walled city, and at that time, when he was fighting this war against at this point the Ottoman Turks, it was reported back in France that Bonaparte has published a proclamation in which he invites all the Jews of Asia and Africa to gather under his flag in order to reestablish the ancient Jerusalem. He has already given arms to a great number, and their battalions threaten Aleppo. So that's the statement that was sort of made, and so it's been debated what the meaning was behind this proclamation of Napoleon. Did he really intend to make a Jewish state as part of the French Empire? Was he just trying to garner Jewish support in the countries he was trying to conquer? Whatever it was, history is left to speculation, because the French campaign in Egypt and Syria is not successful in the long term, and the Anglo-Ottoman combined force will eventually put back his attempts to conquer that area. We already see at this point the Anglos, the British, and the Ottomans are very much tied together, which will continue until World War I, where they will not be on the same side. But as far as what we'll see is the British will come right in to take over many parts of the Ottoman Empire. But be it as it may, at this point, they were able to push back Napoleon, and therefore he never conquers Israel, and we never see exactly what he meant by that proclamation. Was it just of words, like the Balfour Declaration would be later, in which he was trying to garner Jewish support, or did he really intend to make some sort of Jewish state as part of the French Empire? Now, in the most famous or infamous attempt of Napoleon to get involved with the Jews and to really directly try and assimilate the Jews, he formed in 1806, actually on May 30th, 1806, which happens to be my birthday on the secular calendar, he formed something called the Council of Notables, in which he brought together a number of Jewish notables to deal with several questions that were bothering him, and we can see, based on these questions, exactly what Napoleon was trying to do. Here are the questions that Napoleon poses to this Council of Jewish Notables. The questions are, number one, is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? Now, that question is probably based on the idea that as Napoleon came to North Africa and different areas that were the Jewish communities were Sephardic Jewish communities, really at this point, and really for the past 700 years before this point, the Ashkenazi Jews had not practiced polygamy, but the Sephardic Jewish community still practiced polygamy. So he came into contact with Jews who had more than one wife. So, ask the question, is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? Is divorce valid, although pronounced not by courts of justice, but by the virtue of law in contradiction to the French code? In other words, when a Jew divorces in French courts, does that count, or is there a need for some sort of Jewish divorce? May a Jew marry a Christian, or may a Jew marry a Christian woman? Again, that's the idea of, I guess in French, there's, in English, we don't have, in English, we don't have genders to our words, but in other languages they do, so that would read, in French, I guess, both ways. Basically, can a Jew marry a Christian? Or does Jewish law order that the Jews should only intermarry among themselves? In the eyes of the Jew, are Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion considered as brethren or as strangers? What conduct does Jewish law prescribe towards Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion? Do the Jews born in France and threatened by the law as and treated by the law of French citizens, acknowledge France as their country? Are they bound to defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws and follow the directions of the civil code? Who elects the rabbis? What kind of police jurisdiction do the rabbis exercise over the Jews? What judicial powers do they exercise over them? Are the police jurisdiction of the rabbis and the forms of the election regulated by Jewish law, or are they only sanctioned by custom? Are there professions from which the Jew are excluded by their law? Does Jewish law forbid the Jew to take usury from their brethren? Does it forbid or does it allow usury in dealing with strangers? Okay, so you can look at those questions, and we're going to put them in the outline so you can see them written down. If you're watching this on Torah Anytime or somewhere where you don't have the outline, just go to torahcleveland.com/destiny, and you'll see the outlines there. But they're there to look at. But really, they were trying to bring out these issues that Napoleon and the French government had with the Jewish community. Do you allow intermarriage? Do you look at yourself as French or as Jewish? Usury, aka money lending, aka banking, right? They didn't like that idea of the Jewish banker, and therefore the questions are really trying to define the character of the Jewish community vis-a-vis these topics. Now, the response from the Council of Jewish Notables, which is later solidified by a group that Napoleon forms, that he actually calls the Sanhedrin, which we'll discuss in a moment. These are the responses, and this is really, you'll see, was done with great care, but in many ways really opens the door for the assimilation that Napoleon was trying for. So here's the responses that the Council of Jewish Notables gave: that in conformity with the decree of Rabbeinu Gershom ben Yehuda, polygamy is forbidden to the Israelites. Now, that's what we call the Takanas of Rabbeinu Gershom, which only applies to Ashkenazim. If you remember, we talked about 800 years before this, Rabbeinu Gershom, who was the father of Ashkenazi Jewry, and he had the Takanas of Rabbeinu Gershom, which prohibited polygamy, but just for the Ashkenazi community. But that's how they answered it. That divorce by the Jewish law is valid only after previous decisions of the civil authorities. In other words, a Jew can only give a get after he gets a second secular divorce. That is not true, right? That was just trying to fudge the situation. That the religious act of marriage must be preceded by a civil contract. In other words, you have to be married civilly before you can be married Jewishly. Also not true. Now, it is true that in America, there is such a thing as a marriage license, but again, technically you can marry two people according to Jewish law. They never have to get a marriage license. They never have to be civilly married, and it was not the case in France either. It's not the case in Jewish law. So, but that's how they attempted to appease Napoleon. Now, here's a great tiptoeing of words. That marriage contracted between Israelites and Christians are binding, although they cannot be celebrated within religious forms. Right? Now that just opens its way to intermarriage in more ways than one, because basically it was saying that it's binding, meaning that what they were trying to say is that France recognizes it, but there's no religious significance to it, which is true until this day. That's why I always say it is extremely, the concept of a rabbi performing an intermarriage is the silliest thing in the world, because a Jewish marriage is a religious ceremony, and Kiddushin, a Jewish marriage can only, the act of Kiddushin can only be formed between two Jews. So the idea of a rabbi performing intermarriage is frankly the silliest, stupidest thing on the history of the planet. But you can see how rabbis would get the idea, Reform rabbis at least, from these statements of this group. Okay, that every Israelite is religiously bound to consider his non-Jewish fellow citizen as brothers and to aid, protect, and love them as though they were co-religionists. Okay. That the Israelite is required to consider the land of his birth or adoption as his fatherland and shall love and defend it when called upon. Again, echoes of the Reform movement there with cutting the ties to the land of Israel and considering your birthplace really your fatherland, but really not a classical Jewish idea at all. That Judaism does not forbid any kind of handcraft or occupation. That it is commendable for Israelites to engage in agricultural, manual labor, and the arts as their ancestors in Israel were wont to do. Again, Napoleon didn't like the idea of banking, didn't like the idea so many Jews were into banking, so they made some sort of statement that Jews are encouraged to do agriculture, manual labor, the arts, etc. And like our ancestors did in the land of Israel, right? That finally, Israelites are forbidden to exact usury from Jew or Christian. Not really true, right? We'll just say that. The Torah prohibition of usury is a Jew lending to a Jew lending to a Jew cannot lend on interest, and there's absolutely no problem whatsoever a Jew lending to a non-Jew with interest, because if there was, the whole banking system of the world would have never got off the ground. But these are the statements that are made to try and protect themselves. Now, what Napoleon does after this point is he makes three decrees, if you will, three different sets of laws to try and take these positions and establish them throughout his empire. Now, his first attempt in really solidifying this was he made something called the Sanhedrin, similar to which he was playing on a throwback to the Sanhedrin of yore that existed in Israel when the Jews were in Israel still, and he established the Sanhedrin on February 9th, 1807. Now, luckily, the head of the Sanhedrin was a great Rav by the name of Rav Yosef David Sinsheim, who was the great Rabbi of Strasbourg, a great Talmud Chacham, and had ingratiated himself with the government, but he was not a Reformed Jew. He was a true Torah Jew. In fact, we even have one of his Sfarim, one of his books that has been published called the Yad David, and he was appointed the head of the Sanhedrin. Now, the rest of the Sanhedrin was 2/3 rabbis, 1/3 laymen, and out of those, it was a mix of both traditional and Reform, because as we said previously, Reform had made its way into France at this point, and therefore it was a mix of the two, and the different attitudes between the two were pretty obvious. The Reform were totally on board with Napoleon. They wanted the Jews to assimilate, they wanted the Jews to become French, and they really agreed with every one of those responses we just read before. Whereas the traditional Jews, like Sinsheim and others, obviously did not, so to speak, agree with anything that was said in that statement, or much of what was said in that statement. And because Sinsheim was the head of the Sanhedrin, he was able to fudge things and manipulate things and make it that the body essentially really had no teeth to enforce this on the Jewish community. But nevertheless, Napoleon kept trying, and on March 17th, 1808, he makes something known as the infamous decree, in which he tried to take all of this a step forward. And part of the infamous decree said all debts with Jews were annulled, reduced, or postponed. Again, trying to get away from the idea of Jews practicing usury, because as the statement said, Jews don't practice usury with Jew or non-Jews. Therefore, if you have a debt, that's usury, and therefore they were all annulled, reduced, or postponed. And also, the infamous decree restricted money lending activity of Jews. And there were also heavy restrictions put on the Jews' ability to migrate to other parts of the empire, similar to that attitude of the letter that he wrote to his brother. And it required Jews to serve in the French military without an opportunity of replacement. So therefore, that idea of, France being the homeland, and let's face it, Jews involved in militaries, especially in this time where it's not like the military today, where, let's face it, it's not easy to remain a religious Jew in the military, but it's at least doable. And when you sign up for the American military, it's not a life sentence, but in this time period, the military conscriptions were often were mandatory, and were not for years, but were for decades. And they were no place to remain a religious Jew. So it was not very good for a Jew to go to any secular military, whether the French, whether the Russian, whether the Polish. It was not a good thing. Now, the last thing that Napoleon said in this infamous decree is the Jews had to adopt formal names. Up until this point, they were just known by, like my name would have been Pinchas Leib ben Kalman Velvel, but they had formal names now with last names, and that was, again, an attempt to make the Jews more like the rest of the people of France. Now, these ideas went everywhere Napoleon went, and as Napoleon eventually invades Eastern Europe and Russia, these ideas came with them. Now, by the time Napoleon gets to Russia in the first second decade of the 1800s of the 19th century, it is well known what Napoleon's doing in trying to secularize the Jew. And therefore, the Jewish community in Eastern Europe and in Russia was still, Reform had not gotten there yet, Enlightenment had not gotten there yet, Haskalah had not gotten there yet, and therefore the debate was made in the community, well, who do we support? Now, the Tsar was no friend to the Jew. The Tsar had always treated the Jew horribly. Like I'm sure we all remember from Fiddler on the Roof, where the rabbi is asked the question, is there a blessing to make for the Tsar? And he responds, God, please protect the Tsar and keep him far away from us. And that was the attitude of the Jew towards the Tsar in Russia. But when it became the question of Napoleon versus the Tsar, even though the Tsar was terrible, but Napoleon was bringing about a destruction of Judaism. And the same debate will go on really for the next, unfortunately, for the next 150 years of, is it better for the Jew to leave these parts and to go to better places like America, like in this case being taken over by Napoleon, because there was a knowledge, and a true and accurate knowledge, that being taken over by Napoleon or going to America, as we'll discuss after this point, meant throwing away Yiddishkeit, meant spiritual destruction for the Jew. And therefore, many in the Jewish community, or most of the Jewish community, opposed both, and in this case opposed Napoleon and supported the Tsar. Now, what's interesting is the Tsar will actually slightly lighten up on his decrees against the Jews because of their support they gave him against Napoleon, but that will be short-lived, and the plight of Jew in Russia will never be that good until today. And eventually Napoleon is overthrown by a conglomerate of Prussia, England, dissenting views against him, and he will eventually be exiled. He'll come back temporarily, he'll be exiled again, and he'll die in exile. But his influence throughout France exists until this very day, and throughout other parts of the world, it waxes and wanes depending on the place where you're at. Now, the idea of the emancipation of the Jew did not last anywhere, right? Everywhere that Napoleon took over, once it went back to its previous regimes, the Jews were basically thrown right back into the ghettos. But it's interesting, in Russia, there's always been a strong influence of French culture in Russia, and that really also exists until today. So this is Napoleon, and conquering the greater part of Europe during his time, and during the short time that he ruled, he brings these ideas of liberalism, of secularism, of assimilation of the Jew to many parts of the world, and therefore is the forerunner, really in many ways helps to spread reform throughout this part of the world, but is the forerunner to the Haskalah, which we'll talk about next week, because only on the coattails of Napoleon could we have the Haskalah, which will bring the secularization of much of Eastern European Jewry, and that's what we'll discuss in the next session. I thank you all for coming. I thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to being with you again next week.